Welcome to Listening to Silence, a video podcast in which I interview two guests per episode, discussing with them meaningful, productive, and reflective ways in which they use silence in their work and life. My guests are activists, artists, educators, curators, and other cultural practitioners usually working within the field of decolonial memory practice. Today I have with me in the studio two special guests, Frijns and Loretta Lau. Loretta is an activist and artist and performer working with silence very actively in her work. And Frijns is actually a social psychologist who works with silence to some extent, most specifically with non-verbal synchronization. Synchronicity? Synchrony, there we go. I was almost there. But I think both my guests can explain this best themselves. So maybe we can start with a short round of introductions and you can introduce yourself slightly and perhaps immediately say something about the relation to silence that you have with the synchronicity.
Yeah, for sure. So my name is Loretta Lau. I have a NGO in Den Haag. So that's a art and cultural space for people that who are focused in their community and also, for example, like activism. My goodness. Yeah. So like we started our space from the 2021, and then we actually wanted to have this like a safe space for artists that who would like to talk about their activism. And then myself is also a performance artist, but honestly, like before I get to know Gerlov, that I didn't actually know that I was using silence as like a strategy in my performance so actively. So maybe we can talk about that later.
Let's move on to Tom.
Yes, so my name is Tom. I'm a social psychologist. I work at Utrecht University. And I study nonverbal synchronization, nonverbal synchrony. I don't directly study silence, but in my personal and professional life, silence is very powerful. I think the best indication of good friendship is that you can be silent together and not feel the need that you must talk. And conversely, when I'm interacting with my students, I use silence to get them to do stuff because people like to fill silences. So.
Yeah, silence is a very important tool for education as well, right? And a pedagogical tool.
Yes.
Your silence can be an invitation for other people to start speaking. Is that what you mean?
Yes. So if you ask students to say something or do something, they're often very hesitant. But if you then just patient and you wait, they will fill that silence for you.
Yeah.
So it's a way to get people
and
going.
And it can be scary for a new teacher. I remember giving teacher trainings, and one of the exercises we always did was teaching teachers to stand in front of the classroom silently, because a 1 second silence would feel like an hour of silence. Yeah. All right. Maybe both of you can tell us a little bit about your personal relationship to silence before we move into the more professional work. Who wants to start? You want to start?
Yeah, definitely. Like personal relationship. I always kind of like, would like to talk about my childhood.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I think my parents, my family is from the south of China. And then especially like the people from Chiu-Chao, and then they went to Hong Kong for sure.
Mm-hmm.
And then they are such a noisy people. Like the whole family was so noisy. And then we have big family. Like right now we do have like 70 members. 70, yeah. And then it was for me that there is not so many silence time.
Mm-hmm.
Because like people just like, they kind of like having fun, but then also they're shouting to each other. And then like we have like quite a close relationship, and then we see each other, like these 70 people see each other like every kind of like twice in a month. But then like for me to really feel silence is whenever that my parents kind of like punish me.
Mm-hmm.
That's the only time I would have silence in my life. So also that's like they punish you, but then, for example, they will ask you to. So in my in most of the Hong Kong people house that we have the Deiju. So the Deiju actually is like a altar, like a small kind of like red altar with a candle and also maybe sometime like incense. So on the ground and also on the top of the ceiling. And so it's also written your ancestor names. And so they said that, hey, Loretta, you kind of like, you be bad, you need to kneel down there for sometimes like an hour or even longer.
Kneeling for an hour in front of the altar.
Yes. So that's the moment that I feel the silence.
Yeah.
For me, silence is the time that when you are being punished. And also you kind of, also the people, they don't dare to come and talk to you because, for example, I mean, like people just seeing you being punished by your parents.
Yeah.
And then they still kind of noisy in the background.
So everybody's talking except for you. So yeah, it's quite literally a situation of being silenced. So, and then one question before we try to see if Tom has any similar experiences in his life or something else. But what happens in this silence with you? It's like while you're kneeling there silently.
Yeah, I was actually like looking at all the details of the altar, like because like the two of the candle that they are made by light bulb, so they are not like really burning, and then they're in red, and then they have like different kind of like details, and also I keep reading the text of the ancestor like Lao Gong blah blah blah, like there is like this like writing and Thiên Công Địa Chủ, like the sky and the land, like la la la, and then I'd be like kind of start to talk with my ancestor. I just felt like, hey, like, is this fair that everybody was having fun behind me, but then I was leaning here and then like talking to you, like, do you think this is like kind of like I start to talk to myself, I guess, but then also, but I couldn't speak also because you're being punished. So you can't actually speak, but then you just kind of like using your mind to communicating with your ancestor. So this is is my silent experience.
Yeah, no, and it's good, and we'll like let's keep that in mind as we move on, and later we can, of course, because I know that this will come back in your professional work as well, in which you translated this experience. But it's already interesting to see. I'm always trying to zoom out and see how the silences function, and sometimes the ambiguities. So this silence that you experience is a form of punishment, yet you kind of use it as an opportunity to talk to your ancestor or to reflect in yourself. So there is something in there. It's not exactly empowering per se, immediately, but it is at least more than what the punishment was meant to be. It gives you space to think in a way, which is, of course, not originally part of that punishment. So there's already kind of a double thing going on there. Over to you, Tom.
Oh yeah, how do I follow up on that one? Well, I did study secrecy, which is related to silence, but in a bit of a different way. And there's one memory from my childhood that's quite vivid, is when I wanted to have a pocket knife, but I was a clumsy child, so my parents wouldn't allow it. So I got one from a friend. And then I came home, and my mom came to greet me at the door. And instead of just putting up my coat and staying silent, I said, "Oh, you don't have to wait for me. It's okay. You can go into the living room." And she immediately said, "Okay, hand over the pocket knife." She immediately knew what was going on. And as a kid, I didn't understand how she could know this. She has eyes in the back of her head, and moms know things that they can't know. And then as I got older, of course, I realized what actually went on. But that did sort of pique my interest in how we use silence, but also how we use nonverbal communication to express things, but also to hide things. So there's this balance where nonverbal communication can be much more powerful than verbal communication.
Yeah.
So if we sometimes ignore what people are saying, but observe what their body is saying and what the silences communicate, we get a much more complete picture of what's going on. So that's
right. So, but with your mother in that case study, let's say, how did she know, and how do mothers know? It's probably because they're very good at reading the nonverbal communication that is going on. And in your case, probably your entire body was communicating, "I am hiding something."
Yes.
From my mother.
And to try and hide it, I said something like, "You don't have to wait for me," which is, of course, an immediate cue of, okay, you're hiding something.
Yeah.
You're telling needless information. So you're probably Yeah.
There's some implicit or silent meaning underneath it.
Yes.
Yeah. And now that we're on the topic, can you explain a little more about what nonverbal synchronicity is before we dive into it?
Yeah, it's very simple. Basically, it's when we in form and timing when we synchronize. So when we move at the same time, and when we move in the same way. So now our posture is not exactly the same, but people tend to, for instance, adopt a similar posture.
Loretta and I are sitting in the same way. You probably can't see it, but
it's a bit choreographed now, the way we're sitting, and we're not supposed to be moving too much, of course. Like things like when we walk, we tend to fall into synchrony with each other's steps, and then we adapt to each other, so we align to what we're doing. So that makes it basically our interactions more smooth. And when we work together, it's one of the things that helps us work very efficiently, is that we synchronize together, and we all have this tendency to do it.
Yeah, so we synchronize our nonverbal kind of movement, our movements, our body posture.
Yes.
Facial gestures even.
Yes, like when my wife immediately can tell when I've been on the phone with my family, because I'm from the south of the Netherlands, so from Limburg, and my wife can tell. She says, "You've been talking to your mom," because my accent shifts.
Yeah.
And that's also a way of synchronizing to the person you're speaking with.
Yeah, I think the silence here is that probably a lot of people connecting to each other already happens in silence. So when you walk into a room, probably there's a lot of silence, bodily communication going on between people that will make someone feel at home, or make someone feel like the strange one in the room, or make two people feel like they could become friends or not.
Yes. Yes. Even just where somebody chooses to sit.
Yeah.
Gives you information and tells you something about
or chooses to sit at all. Or
yes, exactly.
Remain standing. Yeah. Very good. It's about time for us to start talking about the professional side. I would like to both of you to say something about your individual work. Maybe you can give us an example later about nonverbal synchrony and how you researched it. You can talk about some of your silent performances, and then of course we are going to work towards the Lowlands project that we did. I also know we do this every week, that you guys both brought a personal object. Who wants to start? I think we were with you, Tom. I think you could go first, and then Loretta.
Sure. I wore it this morning already, so I wouldn't forget. So this was my grandmother's. It's a pendant, and it's bronze, but underneath is a piece of shrapnel that she found in her bed in World War II after a bombing, and she always kept it as a reminder of how lucky she is to be alive. And so it's my connection to my grandmother. But it's also, the thing is, she never really talked all that much about her experiences during the war. And when she did talk about it, she would always talk about the liberation, about how she danced in the streets and had cigarettes and chocolate and that sort of the happy moment. But I know that she kept this, that it wasn't all fun and games. But yeah, it's that there was a lot of silence there. So she wasn't very forthcoming in sharing what happened during the war, only when it was finally over. Yeah,
that's very familiar in many different ways. And for anyone who has grandparents or family members who witnessed the war from up close, or is suffering from war trauma to some extent, I think this is a familiar story. It immediately reminds me of my grandmother, who also from the Malaccan side of the family, who witnessed the Indonesian Independence War and didn't talk about the war or what she witnessed, because she was around a 12-year-old girl when she saw it all happen. And afterwards she came to the Netherlands with the first generation of the diaspora, the Malaccan community, and she didn't talk about it at all. She did talk about how happy she was to be in the Netherlands, and how happy she was that her son, my father, had so many children and everybody was doing well. So she would talk about it, but indirectly, and you would know from the gaps between the sentences and sometimes from her nonverbal communication what was really going on and what she was keeping to herself. Yeah. And I guess in the case of the object, it's also a form of it's a silent witness of sorts. It's literally a piece of shrapnel. Yeah. Very good. Thank you, Tom.
Sure.
Over to you, Loretta.
Another necklace.
Another necklace, yeah.
Yeah, another necklace.
It's a common theme here.
Yeah. So you couldn't really see, but then it's a kind of like a tiny angel. My mom bought it in Vatican. So we were traveling to Italy, and then we were visiting Vatican, and then we kind of, how could I say, me and my mom, we don't have like this kind of like I love you talk. I mean, it's also like about our background as a Hong Konger, and also kind of like this traditional like Asian people that they don't really carry love in the
mouth. So there is a lot of talk among the Hong Kong people, like you said before, but then certain things are actually not.
Love
really
is disappeared in our talk. No one talk about love. But and also as I told that like my childhood is kind of a little bit tough, and she had me when she was very young, and she doesn't know how to carry me. This kind of like the little angel is also like I had this experience of like miscarriage. So she was with me like in a very short time, and so I was a little bit think that it's mysterious if she was here or not. But it's also interesting that like a few years later, then I have like a checkup, like an X-ray, and then we found the cyst there. So the cyst means that like the girls was there in a very short time. But then also in between this kind of like 3 years that I had some dreams about her. So I'm always very sure that there is like this little angel always being with me. But it's never about words. It's never like, even in the dreams that we don't talk. We know each other's here. We know there is like this infinity love. And this kind of like the love that without condition. But that's no words between us. It's silence.
Yeah, it's silent. It's a silent form of communication, and it's proof that an emotional connection goes beyond words. Yeah. And it can, again, it's saved in this object. It's a beautiful story. Yeah. Heartbreaking, of course, as well. Yeah. Thanks. Thank you, Loretta. We can segue into the examples of how you guys have worked with silence and nonverbal communication and synchrony. Maybe we can start with you.
So, to talk about my performances, that I definitely will talk about Letter to My People. Which is actually my very first performance. That I did this because of the Hong Kong's the revolution situation in 2019. If a lot of people might know about the anti-extraditional movement in Hong Kong in June time. Before that, from the February, I already knowing there is some protests, but like a very tiny people around, maybe 300 people coming out to talk about we don't want the law to extradite Hong Kong people to go to the Chinese jail.
Yeah, I was going to ask, maybe you can give a little bit of political context for those who don't know.
Yeah, definitely. So basically, like Hong Kong is a British colony for 180 years. And then in 1997, that Hong Kong was handed over so-called back to China. But then if you think deeper, that's like the British get Hong Kong from the Qing dynasty. But then when it got back to China, is already the Communist Party, by the way. So we never, like as Hong Konger, we never think that we are the same people because we don't have the same law. The background and also the foundationally that we don't believe in the law, the communist law in China, especially they kind of don't have monitor in the jail. People can die anytime. People can like being oppressed and then being like under the brutality anytime. Like, they would just say they just gone. Like, we don't know why. And they actually being abused. So that's why Hong Kong people, we have like 2 million people, like 1/4 of Hong Konger actually go onto the streets in the 12th of June in 2019. But actually right before that, there is this occasion on the 3rd of June, which is the actually a symposium in the Docks Contemporary Art Center to commemorate of the 4th of June Tiananmen massacre.
This was in Prague, yeah? The Docks
the Docks is in Prague because at the moment I was living in Prague, And also I was studying as a in a master degree of fine arts. So then I was like, wow, this is a very good moment, because they are not just having the symposium, but then they have also like a commission works from Maria Shabolova, a sculptor, to make a sculpture of the Niu Xiaobo. So Niu Xiaobo was the only Chinese laureate of the Nobel Peace Prize. So in the 2010. But then later he was died in the custody in 2017. So in 2019, they kind of like think that, oh, this is a time that actually to pay tribute to this great man who were in the Chinese jail. As I said, this kind of like dark jail, no one know what is happening inside for 20 years. And he has this hairstyle which is totally shaved because when, like in Hong Kong also, and also in China, when you are a so-called criminal, then if you need to get like a prisoner, that's like you will have to be shaved. So I was like, wow, I wanted to do something in front of this great man. That's why I choose to do the same thing. I asked my very good artist friend to shave my head. In front of the symposium, like in between the symposium, I have like 20 minutes to do so. So everybody was like standing, the chairs was away, and then I just kind of like having my white cloths with my white suit. And then with this cloth, I slowly just put it down. And then for me, the white color is also being quite silent, as well as like it's some kind of how could I tell, severe, like you can feel the kind of like the moment you're in the church,
like a solemn sacred like situation.
Situation. And so I just pull out this cloth, and then I lay down in front of Niu Xiaobo, his bust. And so like I was holding a candle, as how I was behaving when I was young in front of the ancestor, the altar. So then I just felt like this is again like a connection, like a silent connection between me and also the person who deceased. And then to pay tribute to his like sacrifice to the people who lost their freedom, and also he is sacrificing his own freedom for those people also. So then my friends just came along, and then she started to like just shave my hair slowly. And so in that like 20 minutes, like the whole hall was like 70 people standing. They are really silent, like nothing could be heard but the sound from the razor. Like
electrical,
like that. And so honestly, like originally the sound from that shall be very silent if you have like a noisy background, right?
Yeah.
Like when you're having like the hair shave in, you know, a salon, then you have music, you have people talking, then you don't hear it. But then at the moment, people kind of like notice how brutal could it be, and like to see that happen. And so after that 20 minutes, people clap. And then I kind of look back, like some of them already crying. That's as I said, this is the first time of my performance, and I also feel the power of a performance that doesn't need to be loud, doesn't need to have like background music, doesn't need to be like entertaining to make it look like powerful.
給人們嘅信，政權可以剝奪我哋嘅自由，但從未磨滅我哋嘅意志。權力可以剷掉我哋嘅鬢髮，但未能削減我哋嘅尊嚴。人們啊，如果我哋恐懼，我哋就輸；如果我哋仲相信，我哋就更加接近真理；如果我哋願意企出嚟，我哋就會邁向理想。 劉慧婷、黃樂橋，2019年6月4日。
Yeah, no, it's a great example. There's so many layers of meaning and also performative and aesthetic uses of silence. There is the silence of the actual room, which create kind of like a church-like or a religious or let's say spiritual atmosphere. People are being quiet. There's very little context, basically, in terms of explanation, of course. So people will have space to think for themselves and see what am I seeing here. And as you were saying, people were crying. This is also a nice bridge to you, I think, Tom, because there was no instruction for everyone to feel emotional. And all that happened was basically you kneeling down with the candle. People probably didn't know much about the personal reason for you choosing this form, which was related to the punishment that you would receive as a child. But still, it's clearly emotional. Like you said, the sound of the razor is very violent in contrast to the silence of the room, and people started crying. Yeah, thank you. I think we can bridge this to you, Tom. First of all, what did you think about this?
Very powerful. I think I saw some of your performances, and even if you're not in the room, which I think matters a great deal, but then still it's a very powerful message. Even for me, like it's easy to feel something, to get into the emotion of it, even when you just have the sound and image and all of the other senses are missing. It's still very, very powerful.
Yeah. Yeah, and I guess the people crying together, this is also part of your research field, to the extent that probably someone starts to cry and then people start to kind of feel the same way and take over this behavior.
Yeah, especially when you're in the same room, when you're physically present like we are now. It's different for people listening or watching.
Yeah.
But when you're in the same room, this emotional connection happens much more quickly, and there's emotional contagion. Like if you start to cry now, I'm not a very emotional type, but
especially when there's a bunch of cameras on you, probably. But yeah. And I think also in terms of a political potential, because there's this activist side. This is also what I find so inspiring about your work. It's an artistic project that a performance, let's say, which you just described, but there's a clear political reason behind it, alongside perhaps a performative or aesthetic reason too, and an emotional reason. And I think the political potential of the silence that you used in this example is also that people felt an emotional connection, whether they did or did not really understand the full context or the details of the history, the person that you're kneeling to, and the protests going on in Hong Kong at the time. That was basically the backdrop of your performance. People still cried together. And I think if you compare that to the common understanding of activism as shouting slogans and kind of like trying to explain to people why it is important that you build solidarity, it's not an either or question. Both can be important, but this silent way of doing it can bring people in already. Yeah. And it can be a good start for later when they're already invested, explaining what it's all about. They're already there with you. I think I find that very inspiring.
There's already some sympathy there. Because I, as a relative outsider, of course, I have no inside knowledge. I don't know the exact situation. I don't know what it's like for the people involved. But if I see protests, I can think, yeah, I support this, but I don't feel much with it. When I see your performance, I immediately, even though I don't get all of the intention behind it, I immediately feel a connection and a very basic human empathy for. I think that's a very powerful mechanism, and part of that is because you connect to a very basic human thing.
True. So in a way, we could say that Loretta was doing non-verbal synchrony without being conscious of it.
Yes.
True.
Yes. But now you're conscious of it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Now you can deploy it even more actively.
Exactly.
To you, Tom, do you have an example of an experiment that you did or a project that you did to research non-verbal synchrony and how it works?
I'll give you an example of a concrete study that I did with some colleagues at a student festival. It was a festival on social safety, and we did like social psychologists do. We manipulated things. So we had students in teams of 4, and we said, okay, we're going to have a little task for you, but before we'll have a warming up. And then the warm-up was the four of them in the synchrony condition. We had them face each other, stand in a circle, and then they moved as one. So they got 4 little warm-up exercises. They were making rowing motions and up and down motions and moving 4 different things, but all together. So they were instructed to move synchronized at the same time in the same rhythm. And then we had a control condition where people stood in the same orientation, but they all turned around. Mm-hmm. So they couldn't see each other anymore. And instead of doing the motion, the movements all together, they did them like a carousel. So while I did movement 1, you would be doing 2, you would be doing 3, and so on. So just to make sure that, because that's the first thing that psychologists look at, and when criticizing this is, okay, but maybe it's because they were active, maybe it's, so we try to keep everything the same movements, only synchronized or not synchronized. And then we had them in duos. We had them, of course, we asked them some questions, to what extent they trust each other and how safe they feel with each other. Mm-hmm. But what we did is we put basically Legos on the floor, made a little maze, a labyrinth, and then they had to take off their shoes, were blindfolded, and they had to navigate this little maze with one of their fellow students guiding them through it. So that requires trust. And then the synchronized groups reported that they trusted each other more, that they felt safer within the group. And then they also made it through the maze on average like a minute faster than the non-synchronized groups. So that's a nice little study that shows that even if you do something as simple as just moving together, that you build a very basic connection that helps your social relationships. So you trust each other more and you can work together more easily. So that's a very simple example of what synchronizing can do.
It's a good example. It always makes me a little jealous of not being a social scientist where we can like do Legos and kind of have people make rowing movements. And in the humanities, somehow it sounds like fun humanities, but it's more like reading and writing and not any of these social interactions, or not many, except the one time when we came together with Loretta as well and with several other scientists and artists, and we organized a project at Lowlands together.
That was some of the most fun I've had professionally. Yes. So we were basically invited, the two of us were brought together. We didn't know each other before. So I as a social psychologist, knew little about cultural studies. And so they brought us together to see, with your work on silence and my work on nonverbal communication and synchrony, to see if we could do something together. And you already had I worked with artists before. You already had this connection with Loretta and 2 other artists.
Yeah, Michelle Piurgelam, photographer, and Finma Atita, the sound artist.
Yes. And it turned out that we make a perfect team. And we did a very, very nice study. So what we basically wanted to see is how we communicate through art non-verbally. So we had 3 components. We had an art performance that Loretta basically performed 4 times a day, so 12 times in total.
Yeah,
a lot of work. I respect that very much. And as Loretta was doing this performance, people were wearing headphones with a soundscape on it, with the sounds that Finn recorded and created. And then there were pictures. It was inside of a container. For those of you who've never been to Lowlands Science, it's like this big shipping container, dark on the inside. We had some of Michelle's wonderful pictures in there. And then the whole thing was, there was an implicit story about Anansi the spider in there, which has surface layers of a spider that outsmarts a tiger, and then it has deeper layers of outsmarting an oppressor, a mightier opponent. And what we wanted to know is, how do people experience such a performance, and do they get these different layers, to what extent? And then we had 2 little manipulations in there. One was verbal support. So during the sound scape, our voices were heard giving some explanation. Yeah. Then there was one version that really pushed the audience towards trying to figure out the hidden message, and one version where that was absent. And then half of the performances, we asked the audience to explicitly synchronize with Loretta and each other in the first, I think, 5 minutes of the 15-minute performance. And the other half of the performances, we did not ask them to do that.
Yeah.
Right? So that's a bit of the setup of what we did. And of course, we still have to analyze all of the data and have to process it. we asked people what they thought the story was, whether they thought there were any deeper layers in it, a deeper meaning in it. And we asked them about the connection, the emotions they experienced, and so.
Yeah. And then very quickly, just to not leave them out, the team of neuropsychologists, of course.
Yes.
Yeah.
We have our colleagues, Rudolf Tensjes and his team of PhD students and master students who hooked everybody up to the bath cup, the badmuts, the caps, the bathing caps, they look like, to measure brain activity, yes. And Loretta wore it all the time.
Yeah.
And then 4 people in the audience wore it to see whether the brain activation also synchronizes. So we try to see whether the nonverbal synchrony leads to interbrain synchrony.
So it was a truly interdisciplinary project, very interesting to do, very intense. I think especially for you, Loretta. Maybe you want to tell us something about how you experienced taking part in this project.
Well, actually, like I felt like really incredible actually when people were doing the same like movement with me.
Right.
I think it's kind of always interests me, and then this I think it's more like a very first time I really experienced that I'm doing some I was doing something very random.
Yeah.
And I was like putting a triangle up and then circle down, and I felt like, I don't know, a little bit kind of like a cult to me. And then eventually, like when people are really moving along with this, I remember like there was one of my action is like doing this, and then people kind of following, and they are really touching their hand, but then because they're following me, and then like we just kind of like make a very perfect circle together.
Yeah.
And then like no one touching anyone.
No, exactly. No, it also looked beautiful from
It's
the back.
incredible.
Yeah.
I like that you said like random. And if you put people together and tell them to do something random, people are horrible at randomness. We start creating something together, and we all like synchronize to this creative thing that happens together.
Yeah.
And now explicitly, of course, people were synchronizing with you, but if you only instructed to make something together, you would still probably get something of a synchronized movement like that.
Yeah.
Which is
And
amazing.
I was also wondering, did you feel a difference between the performances where the synchronization did happen and where the synchronization didn't happen?
Oh, definitely. I felt like people are more concentrated and people are more engaging
With the synchrony
with
version.
the synchrony one. While the event is finished, and then people always kind of like wanted to know more. And then you can see that the people who did the synchrony, they're much more engaging than the people they didn't.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I got the same feeling from talking to some of the people afterwards, because of course everybody filled out a survey. We still have to read all of that material. It's waiting for us. But then meanwhile, I talked to some people on their way out, and I got the feeling that the synchrony versions of the performance, people were much more enthusiastic. They felt there was a lot of meaning to uncover. And for the non-synchrony version, people always came out a little confused and thought, I don't know, it was a bit abstract to me. So it's interesting to see. Yeah. And I think this can, because we will have to see what kind of conclusions we can draw from this, of course, but we can maybe already speculate a little bit. First of all, that I had for you already was, what is the, let's say, what could be the societal relevance of some of the insights that you get from this type of research about synchrony?
Well, I think if we connect it more broadly to what we were trying to do was, it was not very activistic, but still it was an attempt to get a message across. I would be very interesting to see, and I would speculate that synchrony can play a large part in that. So if you can manage to connect on a physical level to your audience, then your whatever message you're trying to get across is more easily picked up by your audience and also felt like on a visceral level more.
Yeah.
Because activism usually is about stuff that we really care about, right? It's not, I'm not trying to sell you a car or anything. It's something that is fundamental, right? That's a huge difference in just persuasive communication in general. And activism is you're trying to get people to work towards a common shared goal of whatever it is that.
Yeah.
And I think it really helps to connect.
Yeah, it also reminds me of something that you said during or in between one of the performances, actually, that you thought it's interesting to see that synchronizing people together helps so much with kind of trying to bring a message across, not just in words, but also in movement, for example. It's something that you can take with you, of course, if you organize something again.
Yeah,
kind
definitely.
of this idea to create a non-verbal interaction with your audience.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, because one of the most important element is that they are taking part in it.
Yes.
So yeah, as you said that like it's not like you're selling something, you're telling them something, but then they are part of something. Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's sometimes also a bit of inhibition in audiences. Like,
Yeah.
and like at our performances, people really like to synchronize and like to take part, but they're a bit hesitant. And if you explicitly give them permission or encourage them to say it's okay to go along and move along and to take part in this,
Yeah.
then they will, and then they do it together, and then it's not one person shouting, but
Exactly.
it becomes.
And it for us, this is now such a common kind of insight because we've been working with this for a while. But I think for many activists or for organizers of activist kind of particular protests, it can be a useful insight to know this, because very often activism still works from the logic of interruption, disruption. Kind of like start shouting somewhere, for example, and get everyone confused. And this is a way to shake people awake, for instance. And it can work, but there's also kind of, this is at least coming from my own research, there's a fatigue going on, that if there's too many protests and too much shouting going on, that people at some point start to kind of turn off, because there's only so much you can take, basically. And what I like about this approach is that it is a more gentle way of getting people in tune with each other and kind of inviting the possibility of solidarity and mutual engagement. Yeah. Where people can start to feel like, okay, we could work together, and despite differences, or maybe we don't even have the same purpose, we could still find reasons to work together. It's a great basis for alliance, I would say.
Yeah, usually you try to build some, especially if someone is not necessarily agreeing immediately with what you're saying.
Yeah.
You try to build some sort of connection, and you can do that through talking, but you can also do that just in a non-verbal way.
Yeah. Which brings me, I think, to the last section, which is really about the functions that we can see for silence in society. We've already discussed mainstream activism is very often voice-based. Silence is there to be broken. Voices are there to be shouting. What do you think about, when you look around, where do you still see silence in society? Where would you like to see more of it? I would be interested in your thoughts on this.
Well, the shouting and I'm not a big fan of that anyway, but
No.
I think sometimes just the fact that so many people show up there've been some recent protests where more and more people show up each time there's a protest, and the things being said don't strike me much, but just seeing like a sea of people, like,
Yeah.
and I much prefer like the silent type of communication there, of not just when you see them walking, when you see them all
Marching.
that impresses me much more than the shouting and the megaphones and
the sloganism, let's say.
Yeah, I was as I told you about the NGO, like the gallery that we are working on, that we have already doing a lot of like activism with art and with exhibition. So the thing is, at the beginning of the, let's say, not talk about like all the protests yet, but like let's say about the Hong Kong protests, that at the very beginning of the 2 years, a lot of people, they are very engaging to go to the rally.
Mm-hmm.
But then you can also see that like the movement, like it have its time to going up, and then also the movement, it will kind of like, I wouldn't say die down, but then it's kind of like slowly like people kind of like having, then like a lot of Hong Kong people would be like really like they kind of like rejecting, and not just because of they are busy with life, but also because of the national security law started in Hong Kong, and also the overseas Hong Kong people, they are afraid that if they take part of some rally and if someone take pictures of them,
Yeah.
they would be get into a problem when they go back to Hong Kong. So the thing is like this kind of like silent, it's like a chilling effect. It's like really kind of affecting the whole protest. That's why we are doing the art and cultural way of protesting, because they know that people are not going to come out anymore.
Right. So the usual vocal protest is not working, for example, under the national security law, where everything that you say can be used immediately against you with actual violent results. You can be imprisoned for things that you say that are against what the government would like to hear. So basically what you're saying is you're looking for other ways to be able to gather and do protest, and art can be a silent communicator, basically, and a catalyst for solidarity. It's because if you call it a protest and you start having slogans, then people might not show up for self-protection, and which makes a lot of sense.
Definitely. Yeah.
I think the activism is not just protest. So now you see many things happening, but it's also because people, I think two things: people want to do something, but also they don't feel so connected anymore. So they would also like to do something together. And then this part of connecting, you feel connected and you can move along together. Then you get something going that doesn't necessarily require speaking up and shouting, but it can slowly build.
And the funny thing to me is always that some of this sounds quite obvious when you translate it to personal life, for example. Like, for instance, if with your loved one, you need to be able to speak a lot, but you cannot constantly be in dialogue with each other. It gets exhausting. So you need silence, kind of like that is also a sustainable way of being together. You need to be able to be comfortable in silence too, if you want the relationship to last beyond 2 or 3 really interesting conversations. Yet when you translate it back to society, it seems as if this lesson doesn't land very quickly. It seems as if people are afraid of silence, uncomfortable by silence, and that's basically my last question. Like, why do you think that is? What is the problem with silence? Why are people scared of it, or do they find it uncomfortable?
I think like for performance-wise, another example is while I'm doing performance in Hong Kong, just some months before the national security law started, I actually have a chance to do a performance in Hong Kong. And then like I have a box, like a translucent box, small one. Oh, like the confession box. So I just put a paper outside from my box and then say like just written, confess me. So then like a lot of people just pass the box, and then they know that there is a person, but they couldn't see my face. And then because like Hong Kong people, they are not very, there to actually engage with art. They kind of like being quite brutal, like. And then in Cantonese, it's like like I really don't know the fuck. And then like when they're facing art as something that they are not, familiar with, like they don't actually want to kind of like react on you. And then also like because the box itself and me, I was just kind of like staying there until people talk to me. So then it's about like breaking the silence in that performance. So they have to start to talk to me first.
And it worked. And
so I was there for around 6 hours, but then only around 6 people talking to me.
Yeah, but that's interesting, right? So that, it begs the question, like, so this is a silent invitation basically for somebody else to start the conversation, and very little people actually dare to make that.
They feel awkward.
Yeah, they feel awkward to break that silence. So why do you think that is? Maybe you also have some thoughts on this.
Well, I think just being and just not. We feel this need to constantly. We have so much going on nowadays with new technology and more people all the time, and we're just not used anymore, I think, to just being in each other's company, and it's very soothing. People can withstand more pain if somebody's touching them. And if people are together, without doing anything, there are already like major effects. So I think, but I'm of course a social psychologist, I think we are social beings, and being in each other's presence is very powerful for us. But we speak so much that this idea of just being together has lost some of its meaning, or we fail to see how powerful it can be to just be together and act together.
Yeah. Thankfully, it's something that we could bring back. So this is why projects like ours matter. They can help people remember what it's like to actually be together, to move together, to think and feel and listen together. So I would like to thank you both very much for being here. Loretta Lau, Tom
Thank
Frijns.
you for inviting us.
I would invite everyone who's listening and watching this to kind of look up both of my guests and see what else they have done in their careers, because there's so much there that resonates with silence and the general topic that we're working with in this podcast. Also look up Michelle Piergolam and Finma Atita, the other two artists who worked with us on the Lowlands project. And I think with that, I would like to thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Eleka tamatay sa lupiu. Sandete kay tamatay sa lupea. Sa ndete au mina. Leke mtulu mina. Kay ale arekwa. Kay alalenise. Tolone amai rulu suike. Totonai mina. Sa ndete au